Hello, welcome to the latest IOP Speaker Series event, Hate Speech. My name is Gina Montagna, and I'm a second-year political science student in the college. I'm also the U.S. News Editor for the IOP student newspaper, The Gate, as well as an events ambassador. As a student journalist, I'm excited to hear more about how free speech can be a powerful tool both on our campus and places across the country. Our panel today is featuring Nico Perrino, who is the current Executive Vice President of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nico has been with the FIRE team for almost a decade, working in the communications department as the Director of Communications, as well as the host of, so to speak, the Free Speech podcast. Casey Newton is the founder of Platformer News, a news outlet dedicated to covering the latest issues in the social media world. He's a former senior editor and Silicon Valley editor at The Verge, where he wrote a daily newsletter covering social media and democracy. Also joining us is Ahmed Rehab, the executive director of the Chicago branch of the Council on American-Islamic Relations, which is the nation's largest Muslim rights advocacy group. And he also has a widely published op-ed. He often lectures at universities and is a current board member of the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Our final panelist is Laurie Zoloth, who is the University of Chicago Margaret E. Burton professor. She currently teaches religion and ethics here at the university. She formerly taught at Northwestern University for 21 years before coming to UChicago. She earned her PhD from University of California in social ethics and religious studies. This conversation will be moderated by Summer Lopez, the Chief Program Officer of Free Expression Programs at Penn America. As a part of UCED, which is the United States Agency for International Development. She worked abroad in places like Zimbabwe to implement human rights policy. Before we begin, please don't forget to silence your phones. At the end of the discussion, there will be time for Q&A, so please line up at the microphones that will be placed in the audience. As always, we give priority to students. Next week, the IOP is hosting former Associate Attorney General of the United States, Vanita Gupta, for a conversation with CNN's Evan Perez about justice in 2024. That event will take place here at Ida Noyes on the third floor at 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, April 30th. Then, on Thursday, May 9th, the IOP will host a conversation about how Chicago shaped Barack and Michelle Obama, featuring IOP founder David Axelrod and others. That discussion will take place at the Rubenstein Forum, City View, starting at 12:30 p.m. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists, Nico, Casey, Ahmed, Laurie, and Summer.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Gina, for the introductions, and thank you to the IOP for having us, and thank you to our wonderful lineup of panelists, especially. I'm really thrilled for the conversation to bring together people who I hope won't agree on everything, but I hope that we will have a lively conversation and hopefully model what it looks like to engage in meaningful and respectful discourse, which is all too rare these days. So thank you to all of you for being a part of it. We're obviously here in a pretty dramatic moment of societal upheaval. Since the attacks of October 7th and the Israeli government's response in Gaza, we have seen debates rage, divisions harden, and voices being silenced. And this week, we've seen it turn into a conflagration on campuses around the country. At the same time, this week, President Biden signed into a law that would force the sale of TikTok under threat of a ban on social media, on a social media platform used by some 150 million Americans. And there's also an election happening. So amidst all of this, there are crucial questions around free speech, a bedrock value of this country, and one I would argue undergirds all of our other rights. But upholding free speech is complicated and hard. The questions around it are complex. My colleagues and I at Penn America wrestle with them every day. So I'm really excited to hear from the panelists this evening. And we will have time for questions from all of you, of course, so please have those ready too. So I feel like we're also experiencing a somewhat surreal moment in which we're surrounded by a tremendous amount of exercise of the right to free expression, right? There's a lot of speech happening out there. And yet I think most of us also feel very concerned about trends of censorship and censoriousness, both from government and non-governmental sources. So I'd love to kind of quickly just go down the row here and hear a little bit about, do you agree, first of all, that we're in a moment of concern for free speech? And if so, what forms of censorship and silencing are you most worried about? right now. And Nico, let's start with you.
Yeah, and first of all, thanks for having me. Really happy to be here. I'm from the Chicagoland area, so it's good to come home. Since 2013, really, my colleagues and I at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, we're a campus civil liberties group that expanded off campus in 2022. But since 2013, 2014, we've noticed a rise in demands for censorship on college campuses, but also off college campuses. And we peg it to when Ray Kelly visited Brown University. Ray Kelly is the former police commissioner of New York City. And he was set to speak. He spoke for about 30 seconds and then was shouted out and drowned out. And that's really when we started to see these attempts at deplatforming, hecklers, vetoes, shoutdowns, and even violence on some campuses. And most recently, we saw it at the University of California, Berkeley, where a speaker, former IDF soldier, was set to speak, and students barricaded the building, broke glass, and someone was allegedly attacked. So we've been seeing more of that. When I first started at FIRE in 2012, campus free speech was not a hot button issue. Frankly. We used to get one media mention and then we'd blog about it and it'd make our entire day. I think today we had 20-something media requests about everything that's happening on campus right now. So people are obviously interested and concerned about this. And I'm sure we can dive into the intricacies surrounding the encampments that are going up, the tear gas that was reportedly used at Emory today to disperse protesters, the calling in of horsed police officers at the University of Texas, Austin by Governor Greg Abbott. I'm happy to dive into all that, but that's my first blush, is that it's been on the rise for 10 years and I keep waiting for it to subside and it hasn't.
Great. Laurie?
So I had come from a very different angle on this. I'm a University of Chicago professor, so of course, like all University of Chicago professors, deeply committed to the principle of free speech, carry around my copy of the Calvin Report and the Chicago Principles at all times to be able to whip out and defend the principles. I think free speech should be free. I'm eager to hear free speech. I'm eager to hear different ideas. But what I'm worried about happening now, what I think the collapse of free speech now, is not that speech is too censored. It's that it's too hateful. It's morally repugnant. And we don't have a category for this. So I think while speech should be free, we're also capable of judgment and discernment and of saying, this is horrific. This is not seeing reality. This is speech whose intent it is to censor, especially speech that, ironically enough, calls for boycotts, right? And then is upset about censorship. So a speech that calls to censor and then itself is upset about being censored is ironic at the very least and troubling at the worst. So as someone who in the 1960s and 70s spent a lot of time protesting the war, apartheid, various and sundry wars in different places, Eritrea, whatever, and who was arrested over and over again during the Vietnam War era as a University of California Berkeley student, and spent time in jails, including military jails, trying with all I could to make my body the speech act itself. I learned several things about that, one of which was there has to be time, place, and manner limits, as the law says, as FIRE has taught us, on speech, and speech acts have consequence. And so I've been thinking a lot about what are the consequences of the kind of speech acts that we're seeing now, not only for the Jewish community that feels itself to be deeply attacked by this speech that is a spasm of anti-Semitism, but also, what does it do to our democracy to have speech that is, while free, deeply morally problematic? And how do we draw the lines about that? What do we do with that kind of speech? And our rules and our laws are not quite equipped, I think, to think through that question carefully. So maybe we can a little bit tonight, but that's how I'm coming forward.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. For me, I agree. I think free speech should have no limit other than actual hate speech that calls for harm to other human beings. And I think we have the ability to discern the difference between hate speech and non-hate speech. However, what we're seeing today is sort of a misrepresentation of what a lot of these student protests and pro-Palestinian voices are actually saying. If we wanted to know what they're actually saying, all we have to do is to listen to them or to ask them. Instead, we see a lot of effort out there to put words in their mouths or to say, no, this is not what you're saying, this is what you're saying, and this is why you should be censored. So there are two ways that you can censor someone. You can censor someone because you believe they're engaging in hate speech, or you can censor someone because you misrepresent them as engaging in hate speech. For example, there could be a KKK rally, and there could be question marks over whether that should be censored or not per the free speech debate. But we're not even talking about that. We're talking about a firefighters parade and that being called a KKK rally, and then we're debating whether that should be. So that misrepresentation element is very important. That's one of three elements that always come with censorship. One is misrepresentation. The second is suppression, which is the one we normally talk about. And the third is distraction, which I think really is playing into what we're seeing right now, what with the human rights abuses that are happening in Gaza, which is the elephant in the room, that many are calling genocide. At the very least, it's an ethnic cleansing. And so the protests against that is being called anti-Semitic, is being called hatred of the Jewish people, which is not what these voices are saying. And it's distracting from the real victims of the moment, who are dying in very large numbers, in the tens of thousands, other than the ones injured, other than the ones who are dehumanized. And the depopulation of the place, the displacement, the dispossession, we're talking about 85% of the whole country, or the strip that is Gaza. And so we're not talking about that today. That's not the headline. The headline are the student protests and what they're saying or not saying versus what's happening over there. So to me, that's a distraction that does not serve any good for our public debate.
Thanks. I write a lot about free speech in the context of tech platforms. So I'm mostly interested in where tech gets hosted and how platforms feel about it. And your question is sort of what's like the trend that's interesting to you. When I started covering companies like Facebook and Twitter in the early 2010s, they were so excited about speech because everybody speaking on their platforms was another active user and somebody else they could show an ad to. But then you had the Arab Spring happen, and these companies convinced themselves that by hosting more and more speech, they could also be a vessel for spreading democracy around the world. And so they're very excited about speech until the end of 2016. Trump gets elected. All of a sudden, there's this massive backlash, right? It's like, hey, what are these algorithms doing to our brains? Do these algorithms destroy society? And then all of a sudden, the platforms say, maybe we don't want to be speech. Like, we told ourselves that we were building public squares, but maybe we actually just want to be shopping malls. And so you fast forward to today, and you have Meta cloning Twitter with something called Threads. Looks a lot like Twitter. But Meta has come out and said, we don't really care about the news. So you may be wanting to spread the word about an issue that's important to you. You may want to protest, exercise your free speech rights. Maybe that post that you make isn't going to travel as far, right? Maybe they're going to decide, we're actually going to give users features that let them hide words that they don't want to see. So on the kind of product side and the policy side, all of the energy among the tech platforms right now has been in this sort of anti-speech direction. So that's the main trend that I've been interested in over the past few years.
Great. Well, I think we're probably going to return to each of these to some degree this evening, but let's start with campuses.
I might be the only one who will say that the government shouldn't ban hate speech, or at least identify it as a category of speech accepted from the First Amendment. I'd love to get into that.
Yeah, I think we can come back to that one. But I do want to start with campuses, since I know that is very much on everyone's mind over the past week and just today, as you said. I think things were happening even while I was on the plane earlier. And I think it's also notable that what happened in Colombia, where the NYPD was called in about 36 hours into a largely peaceful up to that point protest, by all means. Was also the day after the president of Colombia had been at a congressional hearing where she was under quite a bit of political pressure. So I'd like to hear, Nico, just kind of what, first of all, worries you most about this moment of what we're seeing right now on campuses. There are a lot of dynamics. It's very complex, the sort of safety and speech issues at play, and this political pressure kind of over it. What are your kind of biggest concerns?
Yeah, well, I don't love that congressmen and women are browbeating university presidents into censoring more. This happened in December, right? The implication was that chants like Intifada or From the River to the Sea were calls for Jewish genocide, and then they asked the college presidents directly, does that violate your student code of conduct? And they said, well, context matters. And they were right. Context always matters when we're talking about exceptions to free speech or the First Amendment. If you have this sort of abstract calls for genocide exception to the First Amendment, the first thing you're going to see are people saying that support for Israel's invasion of Gaza is a call for genocide. Or you'll see people who support the Palestinians saying that the people on the other side are calling for genocide. Or you'll have people saying that bans on gender-affirming care is a call for genocide. Or you'll have people who support the pro-life cause saying that people who support abortion are committing a genocide against the unborn. This is what you need to watch out for with these abstract exceptions to the First Amendment. And then you fast forward to when the president of Colombia testifies, and she essentially has to concede that she's going to investigate faculty members for allegedly anti-Semitic remarks, not providing any evidence as to what they had said that might violate university policies, but it's essentially genuflecting before the congressional hearing to admit something or give them something that they want. And then you see the crackdowns. Now, colleges and universities can have reasonable content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. But at the same time, you can't say that everyone who is congregating, who's not setting up a tent or housing in the quad, is violating those content restrictions. There also needs to be space for people to peacefully protest. So you can't paint with that broad brush. And to the extent you're going to use force, it must be the last resort, and the force must be only that which is necessary to enforce the policy. So, and then of course, if you're going to punish anyone under any of these policies, you need to give them due process, and they need to be innocent until proven guilty. And what we saw at the University of Texas Austin is that all the people who were arrested, they had their charges dropped. So that might say something about what they were actually doing that day.
Or perhaps says nothing, actually. Okay, 3 principles.
Well, I'd love to hear why.
Principle 1 is a principle from the progressive left, of which I consider myself a firm member and believer. And what did we say in the progressive left about how you judge hate? We spent a lot of time thinking about it. How do you judge hate? We say believe the women. We say when someone says something that is racially offensive, you don't ask the racist if they think it's racist, because they never do. You ask the black person against who it is directed. When someone says something sexist, we don't ask the man who's saying, I just love women. You ask the woman against whom it's directed. Thus, in this case, when I see these slogans, when I see the reuse of medieval tropes from the 15th century used against Jews, and I tell you it is anti-Semitic, it is classically anti-Semitic, drawn from the dustbin of history, you should believe me, because I'm a minority on this campus and a minority in society, and that is a principle of the left, point 1. Point 2, the Chicago's principles, which we adhere to here. The freedom to debate and discuss the merits of competing ideas does not, of course, mean that individuals may say whatever they wish, whenever they wish. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat or harassment of people, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the functioning of the university. It is not the First Amendment. It's not Jeffersonian democracy. That's out there. It's not on the quad. It's not in my classroom. It's out there. Americans have freedom of speech. Universities have to create a university that functions as a learning environment for discernment. And within the learning environment for discernment and inquiry, we need something better. We need a kind of speech that invites cooperation, that invites dignity, that invites being able to name and defend positions and to hear other speech. That is not what is happening on the quads, not on our quads, certainly not at Columbia, right? It is not happening. What's happening is vilification. What's happening is sloganeering. What's happening is chants. And I disagree with you, Ahmed. It's not a mischaracterization. From the river to the sea is experienced by most Jews in this country as a genocidal threat. It calls for the elimination of the Free State of Israel. It calls for the end of a national liberation process, which is Zionism. It names and defames Zionism as an evil or racist ideology. It is the national liberation struggle for the Jewish people for their own nation and homeland, which is perfectly okay to say and should be perfectly okay to defend. It is not, and hearing it vilified is in fact doesn't make me sad or hurt or wounded. It makes me angry because it's not thoughtful, it's not historical, and it doesn't invite critique. And when universities say this and say we want critique and we want discourse and we want an environment in which people have a chance to have open discourse, right? To talk about politics, to talk about facts, real facts, defensible facts, not unjustifiable claims, that's okay, and they're allowed to say that. And I'm sorry, the third point. The third point is brought to us by a combination of Henry David Thoreau as amended by Hannah Arendt. And that is civil disobedience is about disobedience. Civil disobedience is not about having an encampment. It's about breaking a law. Breaking a law you think is unjust, right? That's what it's about. Challenging a law that you think is unjust and taking the consequences for your disobedience. If you wanted to be obedient and you wanted everyone to love you, you wouldn't be breaking the law. Your expectation is that people will say, that's breaking the law. That's breaking our rules. And you have to take the punishment for that. And taking the punishment, right? Taking the charges, taking the punishment is part of the noble action of a free person. A free person should take the punishment for which they have signed up for. And when someone says to you, if you do not leave our space, which is the protected space of the university, for discernment and discourse, if you violate the rules of the university, which is no camping out, right? Then, and they say, and if you don't do that, we will arrest you several times. Then guess what? You're arrested because you've broken the law and you've been warned and you've had the chance not to break the law. That's why people wear the different armbands, because it's part of the semiotics of civil disobedience, which is a semiotic performance of disobeying a law you think is unjust. So those three principles: believe the person who's the subject of the vitriol as the person who discerns the meaning of the vitriol. The Chicago principles and principles of disobedience as articulated by Thoreau and Arendt.
I think the civil disobedience question is an important one, and I think the way things played out at, I think it was Yale last weekend, seemed to kind of fit within that framework. I believe students were, it was campus police that was used. Campus police sort of arrested the students who agreed to be arrested. It all happened peacefully. It seemed deliberate, again, sort of conscious civil disobedience. It kind of went by the playbook of that. I'm curious, Ahmed, maybe you want to say, how much do you think of this as a conscious civil disobedience effort? And do you think a lot of the students are coming into it with that consciousness of arrest being a part of kind of the goal, as Laurie's saying?
I mean, we're talking about it like it's like we're reinventing the wheel. Like this is a new discovery. It's a new phenomenon where we're trying to probe and understand. This is an American pastime. This is part of American history. This is what you claimed you were part of, and I believe you when you say that back in the 60s or whatever. This is a Vietnam moment. I mean, what's happening in Gaza right now is larger than life. It's an extraordinary moment in our human experience. And here's why. There are three forms of humanitarian sort of crises. One is a natural disaster, whatever form, tornado or hurricane, an earthquake. Our hearts go out to the victims. We help them. There's nothing we can do to stop it. It's a natural disaster. Then there are man-made disasters, and there are two types there. One is one that is created by a country or a power that we consider a foe, as the United States of America, and that's usually the case. And what we do then is we stand up to that foe, and we stand with the victim, we support the victim, as we're doing with Ukraine, with weapons, with humanitarian aid, with our public statements, etc. But in this third and final case, here we have an ally who's committing these atrocities, and we are supporting this ally. We're giving diplomatic cover to this ally in the United Nations. We're giving them weapons to continue to do what they do. We're giving them money in the billions of dollars, even after these atrocities were committed. And while all this is happening, as students stand up and say, look, we disagree with this, we think this is wrong, they're then vilified, they're then accused as being terrorists or pro-terrorists or anti-Semites or whatever, and it chills their ability to push back on what is something that should be pushed back on. I mean, to use your first example of the principle of the progressive left, that the victim should be believed, that's sort of a double-edged sword, because if you look at, you can use that to say, well, the victims of violent Zionism should be believed when they say that they have been erased, they have been dehumanized, they have been depopulated and dispossessed and displaced, etc. And that when they are calling for freedom in their ancestral homeland, they are not calling for the demise of another people or the mass murder of another people. None of them have ever said that. None of them have said anything that insinuates that. As a matter of fact, when accused of saying that, they will deny and say that's not what we're saying. From the river to the sea, for those who say it amongst the Palestinian population and their supporters, means freedom in 3 ways, in the 3 different territories. In the West Bank, they're talking about dismantling the oppressive systems of the violent settlers and the IDF that supports them and the land grabs. They're talking about the expansions, illegal expansions. That's what they're dismantling. That's what the freedom is for. When we're talking about the Gaza Strip, it's the siege, it's now the genocide, it's the displacement and the mass murder with American weapons. When we're talking about Israel proper, we're talking about freedom from being 3rd, 4th, and 5th rate citizens. And so to dismantle these systems of oppression without killing anyone or moving anybody away from this land is the freedom from the river to the sea, per their own words. We don't get to tell them what they mean. You know, we've told them, look, you don't belong where you're born. You don't belong where your heritage is. We're going to take that away from you. We're going to take away your souls from your bodies, in 34,000 so far. And on top of that, we're going to take the words out of your mouth and the meaning out of your mind and tell you what you mean. This is what you should be saying. It's not what you're actually saying. So to me, that is a form of suppression, and it is censorship, and it is problematic, and it's counterintuitive. It's gaslighting, especially as these atrocities are happening right now. They're the villains in the story.
Can I just say, we're not here to debate the war or the politics of the Middle East. If you want to do that, that's another thing. We're here to debate free speech on campus and its limits.
Well, you're saying that they're saying from the river
that.
to the sea is a genocidal statement. And so this background informs my response to that very strange statement that you made.
And I
so
think,
it's not out of line to say that.
I mean, it's actually quite, I think it's quite interesting because, you know, I recognize the campuses, I think campus administrators are in a tough bind, right? Some of them are making some very problematic decisions. But, you know, I do think that, and some administrator that we were talking to was pointing out that oftentimes student protests are about students versus administration. In fact, almost always, the students are angry at the administration or they're angry at those in power. And right now, campuses are dealing with cases where students are often angry at each other and they're on opposite sides of this conflict, and that's somewhat unique. And so I think that puts them in a different sort of position, and you have, you know, language that for one student is about liberation and for another that is about annihilation. How, you know, if you were sort of advising some of these presidents, how would you tell them they should be managing this situation?
Well, I wouldn't have a hate speech code. Christopher Hitchens had a nice heuristic. He one time gave a speech in Toronto where he asked the audience, who for you would you let decide what speeches you can hear, what movies you can watch, what books you can read? There's not a person in this audience I would have determined for me what speeches I can hear, what movies I can watch, and what music I could listen to. Maybe there's some angel out there who's immortal, to whom I can entrust this power, but you know,
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you might entrust Obama one day, but then you have Donald Trump, right? And when the first big hate speech code was passed on college campuses in the 1980s at the University of Michigan to address anti-black racism, you know who the first student that policy was used against? It was a black student. When in the 1970s, the National Union of Students in England passed a hate speech code, they asked the Zionist student union in that country to support it, and they did. A few years later, guess what was determined to be hate speech? Zionism. So if you do not trust your administration or those in authority, why would you give them more power to determine what's hateful? To determine for you what speakers you can hear, for you what you can say. So I think you know, whatever else you think of it, tactically, it's a poor thing to advocate for, because you're just going to end up biting yourself in the butt.
Hence the Chicago principles.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, which are very smart because it's like you know, Odysseus tying himself to the mast, right? Whenever you feel the urge to censor, you can point to this other thing which kind of relieves you of the responsibility of determining whether a certain speaker should or shouldn't be allowed to speak. So it's very smart. I think there's a book coming out called the Chicago Canon or something, which relates to the Calvin principles in the Chicago statement.
Okay, I want to come back to campuses, but I also want to go to Casey because, as I said, sort of the other big thing that happened this week was Biden signing this law about TikTok into effect. And I'd love to sort of hear your take on it. Tell us a little bit about, what's going on here. What does it mean for the U.S. With the First Amendment to be in a position to potentially ban a platform for expression that serves, half our population?
Yeah, it's a really extraordinary case. I've learned a lot over the past week talking to First Amendment scholars. Something that is sort of counterintuitive to remember is that Chinese propaganda is absolutely legal in the United States. There's Supreme Court case law about this. You can read the People's Daily. It's distributed here in the United States, so that's fine. And at the same time, TikTok is one of the most popular apps in the entire world. And Congress is really concerned about it for a variety of reasons, and now they have passed it. And it's really surprising in the sense that this is basically the first tech regulation that has been passed in the past decade, was this thing that could likely result in a ban of TikTok. And where the First Amendment comes into play is that if the Supreme Court, which we believe will probably hear this case, believes that Congress acted because it didn't like the content it saw on TikTok, that would make it a violation of the First Amendment, and this thing probably would get thrown out. And so what the government will probably do instead when it goes to court is to say that this is a national security issue and that it has nothing to do with the content, but that China is a foreign adversary, and so if and when there is some sort of greater conflict with China, we sort of just don't want China owning an app that could be used for some nefarious purposes. So that's kind of the shape of the debate as it's taking shape, to use the word shape twice.
So, do you feel like there are real concerns about TikTok? Is there some legitimacy in there to your mind?
I think the argument that resonates with me the hardest is that historically we have had rules around foreign ownership of media properties. We sort of generally want most of our big media institutions in the United States to be owned by American companies. But in 2013, those rules were actually loosened. So we don't even have super strong rules around it right now. And rather than sort of pass a framework for how and when we might allow foreign companies to set up big media institutions here, we're sort of just letting one grow to 170 million users and then banning it. So that seems like kind of a suboptimal approach to that.
Right.
How long has TikTok been around?
It was founded in September of 2016.
So about 8 years?
Yeah.
So why now?
Why now? To do that, you sort of have to get into Congress's head. I think there are a number of things happening at the same time. Number one, I just think that we are in the middle of this panic over what algorithms are doing to our brains. There are states around the country that are passing laws designed to get young people to just stop using social media altogether, or only use it with the parents' permission. And because they have not figured out a way to do anything about that in the United States in a way that would be constitutional, I think they've looked at China and TikTok and said, well, let's just get rid of that one and see what happens, right? That's sort of my armchair psychology theory. The things that Congress has actually said is this is a data privacy and security issue. It is true that ByteDance has spied on journalists through TikTok. That's a real thing that happened, and it's bad. And you could ask, well, how many more Americans do you want that to happen to before you take action? And then the final thing is just, again, this well, what if there's war with China? Would the government of China force ByteDance to push pro-Chinese propaganda, which sounds scary, and you can get a member of Congress to vote to ban TikTok, but every scholar I've talked to said that's a blatantly unconstitutional thing to do.
But then you would at least have the war powers in play, presuming Congress declared war, which it hasn't done in almost 100 years. But that would raise different questions and perhaps give the government greater authority.
Is there anything to the national security thing?
Well, so the government really hasn't said. We have the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is the federal agency that is supposed to sort of work these things out. If there is some sort of investment deal that looks bad, this group, which is called CFIUS, goes in to investigate. They investigated for 5 years. They said not one thing about anything that they found. And so when this comes to court, I talked to one scholar who said the government is going to have to show its work. It's going to be subject to what they call intermediate scrutiny, and that means that the government is going to have to say, yeah, we found this specific thing. But as far as I can tell, there have not been very many dramatic cases of anything untoward happening.
Yeah. And it's also broader than TikTok. We need to understand that. When the law defines foreign owned entity, it defines it in ways such as like at the direction of a foreign national from one of these 4 countries, Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. Or it has 20% foreign ownership. So you could see a startup tech platform, for example, that has foreign investors from Russia or one of these other 4 countries getting banned without these sort of broader data privacy concerns. And it rests almost unilateral in the authority in the president to determine when a ban or forced divestment is going to have to happen. And I think we should also invert the question by asking ourselves, okay, let's say a ban goes into effect. How does it actually get enforced when you have an open internet, right? Okay, so maybe you can't get it on the app stores anymore. Are they going to go after the VPN users? China has this great firewall that America has criticized for a decade now. Are we going to set up our own firewall? This would be, I think, the first time we've prevented Americans' access to something that is available on the open web. So this raises big questions about small L liberalism and the sort of confidence we have in the small L liberal project. Some critics of the small L liberal project call it a suicide pact because we allow these foreign entities to share their propaganda within our borders. But I think that speaks to a certain degree of American exceptionalism, that we feel confident enough to engage with ideas or propaganda that might come from elsewhere. Is this an implicit admission that maybe we're not? I don't know, but it does raise interesting questions.
Can I ask a question about this?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's the University of Chicago, so perhaps the opposite is equally the case, right? So what about the problem of AI-generated fake news and the fear that, in fact, as in the earlier elections in this country, the Russians will, in fact, flood the internet with absolute fakery? And so if our capacity to discern truth from untruth is critical to our understanding as to be citizens, our successful capacity to be citizens, what about that? What's the plan? Is there a plan for that?
Well, that's a great question, first of all. But it's also not a unique concern. Back before people were literate, frankly, the written word had this authority to it. And that anything was written seemed to always be true to people who were illiterate. Or you have Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds, radio is a new medium. And people in New York rioted and went crazy because they thought it was being invaded by aliens, right? So there's always this sort of degree, there's this period of time where you need to adjust to new technologies. The printing press was invented, and Europe was engulfed in war for centuries. That just introduced millions of people to the conversation. Now you have social media, and it's introducing billions of people to the conversation. You're going to have that sort of anarchic period. And I would say, I am concerned about fake news, lies, misinformation. There's always some sort of new euphemism to describe what is falsity. But I don't know that the answer to that is ever set up a ministry of truth within the government to determine what is fake. I think the answer has to be increased media literacy and less credulousness on behalf of Americans.
But I think de facto, little by little, we are seeing the formation of a ministry of truth. That is what is de facto happening. Because the question of who gets to decide what is good information or true information, in third world dictatorships, the answer is the government. They get to tell the citizen, hey, this group of people, they need to be barred, they need to be banned, they need to be in jail because what they're telling you is bad for you, they're brainwashing you, you need to not to listen to them anymore, they're bad people. In the United States and free countries, the tradition has been, we're going to let the citizen be the final arbiter of what is good for them, of what is truth and what is falsehood. Otherwise, there'll be calls to shut down Fox News by the left and calls to shut down MSNBC by the right, and it goes on and on. But what we're seeing today is we're moving away from that, and we're beginning to entertain very seriously the notion that the government, Congress, will determine what is good and what is bad for the citizen, and they get to institute that by law and make it illegal to engage with those that they say are bad for you. And why now? I mean, I asked that question earlier, and we need to look beyond face value. If you listen to the members of Congress who have been the most vociferous on pushing this TikTok bill, they themselves have said that TikTok has become a cesspool for terrorism support and Hamas link, blah, blah, blah.
It's terrible for the record when that goes to court.
Right, but the point here is that, again, what's behind the scenes? They're saying this is pro-terrorism, pro-Hamas, between parentheses, pro-Palestinian, and so it needs to be shut down. That is a form of censorship. You look at Facebook, you look at other places, I mean, they're doing what people call shadow banning. I don't know if you guys believe in that. I know, I feel I'm a victim of that. I used to get thousands of engagement on my posts. The moment I started posting about what's happening in Gaza, it trickled down to the tens. I can't prove it. Their algorithms are in a black box somewhere in a dark room. None of us can ever, open up that box and see what's in it. It's a monopoly. It's growing. I've built my presence there over years and decades, all fizzled and lost in a moment, right? And so I feel that's an injustice. I feel that's a form of censorship. I'll close with this on this point. Recently, we had a Muslim woman out in Oklahoma, I believe, who was visited by the FBI. This clip went viral. And they knocked on her door and they said, look, Facebook gave us these 2 posts that you made. That's what the FBI said on record. And we just want to talk to you about them. So now we're getting to this point where Facebook is working with the FBI to basically rat on its own, and there was nothing wrong with these posts, by the way, for the record, but the fact that this is even happening should be scary for those who believe in freedom and against government censorship and corporate censorship.
So
And I wanted to.
No, I'm just curious about this, right? So I want to think, but there is evil in the world. There's true evil in the world. There's bad guys in the world, and there's people who hate American democracy, the project of American democracy, and want to destroy it. Absolutely, right? What should we do? What should be? I mean, I'm just posing the question.
Yeah.
We have an FBI. It's a federal bureau of
It's a fair question.
It's a fair question. Like, if there was a bad guy, wouldn't you want somebody for the government to
But
knock
that's
on the
why you
door
have,
and find them? I mean, of
yes.
course. So let's just separate out. First of all, separate out Hamas and Palestinians. Very different. I'm talking about one and condemning the murderous actions of a terrorist organization that broke a ceasefire to start a war is one thing versus being anti-Palestinian. Let's make that distinction very, very clear.
But it's never really made out there.
Well, let's make it right here. We're going to make it right now.
To serve censorship.
We're going to make it. We're going to make it right now because it's
You and I agree on that.
It's an important distinction. Because murders really can be called evil, and we can agree on that. Kidnapping, murder, breaking a ceasefire to do that.
Would you agree with the same with the IDF murdering 34,000 people? I'd like to agree on that too.
We cannot agree on that.
All right,
because
we're gonna keep it to speech.
And we're not talking about that.
We're gonna keep it back to the topic of speech.
I'm just trying to sort of parse out if
the standard is murder of people, it's 34 times more. So
that's not how math works. It is.
It's
not.
34 times 1,000.
If we're going to talk about
I want to ask.
We can talk about people in a war who are fighting.
To your point, I mean, to get back to censorship. If we're talking about,
I'm talking about FBI. I want to talk about this problem of evil. I think it's really.
How do we deal with content that is actually potentially a threat to national security?
Well, I mean, that's a question that's been posed countless times in our tradition, and this is why we have freedom of speech and we have a free nation. We say that the ultimate line is what is legal and illegal. It isn't what I don't like or like. It isn't what I think or don't think. It's what's legal or illegal. So short of what is illegal should be fair game. You may not like it. I mean, we were told, the Muslim community, and I actually agreed with that, back in the Prophet cartoons, if you remember that whole controversy.
Yeah.
What was it? Je suis
Charlie.
Charlie Hebdo. Yeah. That. So, as a lot of Muslims were very offended by that, and they hold a very deep, respect for their Prophet, and they were very offended by that. They were told, look, tough luck, you don't like it. This is the West. We beat our chests with this kind of stuff. It's freedom of expression, even if you hate it, even if it's sacrilegious, even if it's offensive. But we stand with the right of the European and Western citizen to express themselves in whichever way they see fit. And I kind of agree with that, actually. But now we're kind of like falling back and saying, oh, no, not in all cases, only when it serves our purposes, but not when it threatens something that we hold dear.
So I want to ask about the platforms in particular, Casey, because I think, what's been interesting to me, and I also go back to kind of your experience with moving Platformer off of Substack, and you did that in part because they were not sort of refusing to take down anti or pro-Nazi content, essentially, because they had a very open content policy. I feel like it's not so dissimilar from what Elon Musk came in saying he basically wanted to do at Twitter. Obviously, the reality is more complicated. But I think we've also seen that the result of basically no content moderation is problematic too, right? That it can become just sort of a cesspool of bots on the one hand, but also sort of hate and harassment on a platform like Twitter that kind of goes out of control and makes it a place that nobody actually wants to be on and expressing themselves. So, what do you think we should be taking away from sort of what we've seen happen at Twitter, X, whatever we're going to call it, in terms of what we should learn about content moderation, how we deal with speech?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of feels like a small point compared to everything that we've been discussing on stage tonight, but something that I do feel like we have learned over the past few years that is at least somewhat counterintuitive is that even though it drives people absolutely crazy, and we've heard tonight many of the ways that it's driving us all crazy, when you don't have it on some sort of online platform, the platform collapses, right? So like Twitter has lost something like 3/4 of its value. The main thing that has changed is that there just isn't as much content moderation anymore. I think Substack will fail. I don't think that it will fail entirely because of its lack of moderation. In fact, I think its lack of moderation is in service of a business idea, which is they just need as many people as possible on that platform, or otherwise it's going to fail. But whenever you hear in Congress people talking about, we need to repeal Section 230, we need to take away platforms' immunity from prosecution for doing content moderation, at the end of the day, these platforms have to do it, or otherwise everyone disappears. And so in that sense, it's sort of an easy call for them that they have to do some level of it. I think they've been sort of recalibrating how much of it do they want to do. There are these really impossible questions. The worst of them try to do these sort of one-size-fits-all rules across the entire globe when there are so many different cultures and norms that need to be taken into account. But all of that said, it's still way easier to do that than to do it like in civil society where the government, where you have the First Amendment, where it's just much tougher.
Yeah.
But the government does regulate some speech. For instance, in bioethics, we think a lot about how drug claims are regulated, right? And they have to be regulated. They say them really fast, all the scary stuff, but they do have to say them. You can't just sell snake oil and tell people, oh, this snake oil is going to do X, Y. It has to be, there's a federal regulation of drugs, of devices, of cars. We have rules for speeding. We have there's a lot of regulation in our society. And part of it is to regulate falsity, mendacity, right? So maybe if the most valuable commodity isn't snake oil anymore, but it's your attention or your Casey's work on the platform, maybe that's the most valuable. So maybe there has to be, could there be some kind of regulation that's not, I know you don't want this, but but could there, something like the FDA for speech, like, Socrates Socrates did not want writing. Socrates argues against writing, and the Phaedra does not want writing because why? Because people can lie in writing.
Yeah.
And that he's worried about lying.
I mean, my short answer to that is like, we have a federal communications commission for like broadcast media. It makes sense to have something like that for the internet, right? Like, I think it makes sense, like, what kind of content do small children see? What kind of data is collected about them? Like, to what extent can they be targeted for advertising? These all seem like really appropriate questions for a federal agency to look into. My own preference would be to do it in a way that was like relatively content neutral. Otherwise, we just sort of wind up in all these traps, but you could build something like that.
You can do that? Is that okay,
well,
Bob?
the problem, to speak to the regulation of content accessed by minors and also data collection with minors, is you need to determine who the minors using the internet are, and that requires age verification, which opens up this whole other can of worms. But one thing that was interesting, Casey, I read an interview you did with The Verge about your reasons for leaving Substack, and I think you made an interesting point that we at FIRE have observed as well, that when you first went to Substack, you kind of saw it as a SaaS company, a software as a service company that is like sort of an internet intermediary that's like viewpoint and content neutral, and it's just allowing people to create a platform for themselves, much like an ISP would, or like some sort of malware blocker is, or a bank is, for example. But then your big issue was with the recommendation algorithm. I'm on Substack, my podcast, so to speak, is on Substack, and it's a very powerful algorithm. So I think your concern was more with the algorithm, if I'm not mistaken, rather than with just kind of the internet intermediaries and whether they allow these things to exist on the internet in the first place, right?
Yes. I don't know how much more people want to hear about this, but I mean, yeah, like it was definitely true that like there was suddenly a world where platformer posts were going to appear next to like paid Nazi posts, and because I write largely for an audience of people who work in tech and particularly work in trust and safety, I just have people saying like, why is like the content moderation blog on the Nazi network? And I needed a good answer to that question.
Content moderation is really tricky, and let's be clear. These are private companies who have the right to moderate content. And when you see laws like those passed in Texas, where they say that social media companies over a certain number of users can't discriminate based on viewpoint, what you're essentially saying is they cannot have an algorithm to feed you content, because the algorithm necessarily discriminates based on viewpoint to determine what you get fed, because it determines what viewpoints you're most interested in hearing. And so if you're adopting this sort of First Amendment standard with private social media companies, what you're going to end up seeing are crush videos, animal crush videos, which are protected by the First Amendment. This is like killing animals on video.
Right.
Beheading videos. Porn is protected by the First Amendment. So you need to allow these companies to have the editorial right under the First Amendment to moderate content. Now, that doesn't mean these companies can't be criticized for how they moderate content. In fact, I criticize them all the time. I host a free speech podcast, and the thing that people come to me the most about is what they perceive as censorship on social media, because it's how they experience censorship most often. And oftentimes they have a case that these rules are arbitrary, and it's not clear why they're getting banned, and it's not clear how they can appeal it. I totally sympathize with that, but the answer to that isn't to violate the First Amendment and regulate social media companies so that they can't even have algorithms anymore. The answer is to make the moral argument, and I think Substack actually does better than most with content moderation. I don't think that the recommendations are feeding up a bunch of Nazis all the time. I think X probably has a bigger issue with that than Substack does, but nobody's doing it perfectly.
Yep.
Nobody's doing it perfectly, and none of them are above criticism.
As a former software engineer, I still say
Didn't know that part.
we need to denerdify the conversation. I think I speak for at least half of these people.
I'm learning all these words. I'm learning all these words.
Oh boy, I broke the first rule of public speaking.
Sass.
Sass, right?
So, Ahmed, I want to ask you a question about some of the work that you do, and I think it's related to the issues of free speech and disinformation, but also to sort of the broader state of our democracy. Because I know you do work on sort of bridge building and relationship building between communities and law enforcement, elected officials, et cetera. I feel like a lot of what we're wrestling with today is sort of a deficit of trust in our society, and that makes it difficult for people to feel like they can speak freely, but also for people to listen to one another, right? In theory, that is supposed to go in both directions. Could you tell us just a little bit, do you agree, do you think trust is playing into some of the dynamics that we're seeing right now, and what do you think we can do to bridge these divides? What are things that you've seen work?
So I started my activism only a couple of years after 9/11, and so this was a very thick and heavy atmosphere here in the United States, in which it was almost anything goes as it pertains to Muslims. You could turn on CNN and the lower third would have a question that is as basic and simplistic and insulting to anyone's intelligence as, is Islam a violent religion? Islam, all of it, all 2 billion and 1,400 years of it. And that was a question on CNN, Anderson Cooper. This wasn't Fox News or some cesspool blog on the internet. And that was life as we knew it then. You're probably not in this atmosphere today. I think now we're more nuanced, and Muslims have staked more space in the conversation. There's more respect for the community. So trust had to be built, but also we had to fight against essentially what was dehumanization, which is the same battle that we're fighting today as it pertains to Palestinians, in my opinion. But the trust point to me means this. It means we should be able to have difficult conversations. It's not averting the difficult conversations. It's not having sort of an agreement before we sit at the table that this is on the table and this is off the table, which happens a lot in the United States and maybe around the world when different groups talk to each other. I'm of the opinion that you bring it all to the table so long as it's what you genuinely believe, as our Constitution says about religion. Genuinely held beliefs are protected, right? So long as it's what you genuinely believe. I want to hear it. I want to understand it, even if I disagree with it, even if I may not like it, because I think that will serve the conversation, and whatever progress is made is real. It's not tokenized and it's not peripheral. And so I think that's what we're lacking today, is that there's so much conditions and so many rules, and you can't say this, you're not allowed to bring, we agree to talk about this, why are you talking about that? We need to be able to have real conversations.
Yeah, and free speech is essential to trust. Let's make a comparison to the criminal justice system, right? You're not going to trust the outcome of any sort of criminal case unless you trust the process that arrived at that outcome.
Right.
So if we have a national dialogue about an issue and people feel that not all perspectives were able to be brought to that dialogue, they're not going to trust the outcome of that dialogue, whether it be legislation or some other sort of policy. And we saw that with COVID, right? A lot of people felt like certain perspectives on how to address COVID were suppressed, and therefore they stopped trusting the science. And you can see this in numbers of contexts. You see it in the political context all the time. So free speech is a trust-building, truth-finding process, and censorship undermines it.
Okay, we're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I want to try to end this on a positive note. So instead of asking you what was worrying you in this moment, can each of you tell me something that's giving you hope about the state of free speech in the country at the moment? Casey, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, it's super nerdy. Actually, I'm going to ask a show of hands. Anybody here heard of the Fediverse? Does that mean anything to anyone? Okay, right here, gold star. Over here too. So because of all the frustrations with social media, many of which we just discussed, some people are starting to say, like, why can't social media look more like the open web, right? Like, why, if I don't like the part of social media that I'm on, why can't I take all my followers somewhere else? Or can I maybe go somewhere where I know that my views aren't going to be suppressed? And so you're starting to see companies come together and federate their networks, which just essentially means that servers are going to be able to talk to each other even if they're not part of the same service. So what am I talking about? Well, Threads, this thing that Meta launched last year to combat Twitter, it is now federated. So if you're on Mastodon, which is another one of these social products, these two things can start to talk to each other. The reason this is important is eventually my hope is all of us are just going to be able to pick the content moderation we want, right? If you want to have the absolute most free speech in your timeline and you just want it all, you're going to be able to have that. If you want a very sort of narrowly tailored view of the internet that doesn't contain sort of views that you're likely to find upsetting, you can have that too. I think that so much of the frustration we feel right now is just that there are these one-size-fits-all rules that are being applied to these massive global platforms, and the Fediverse might be a way where we can claw back a little bit more of that personalization and have the kind of communication that we want.
Do you want to go next? I can defer to you.
No, I'm just thinking what an interesting idea that is. No, go ahead.
I think there's a lot of gaslighting happening in America, a lot of gaslighting. And I think what I have hope in and what I'm happy to see is a lot of people are waking up and pushing back on that and seeing and identifying that. You know, there's all this fear of the democratization of social media. I was more fearful when it was limited to an elite corporate bunch who get to decide what is newsworthy and what the editorial slant should be and what the American people should hear or not hear. Today, it's user-oriented. When you talk about social media, I don't know if you agree with this, I mean, corporations and corporate boards have a role to play, of course, on how the algorithms and accessibility and all of that, but ultimately, it's the users who define the content. And so user-defined content, to me, is a better world than leaving it to gatekeepers who are few and far between. The second point to be made is, to answer the question which was on the flyer, I'm a stickler for answering questions directly, who is censoring who? The simple answer to that is, and I think it's always the case historically, it's the powerful or those with more power who censor those with less power. It's never the other way around. There's always a power dynamic. It's the same with any abuse or occupation or anything, right? It's always the powerful who have the upper hand over the powerless. And so when we turn the tables around and start to look at those with less power and say, you're scaring me, you are the villain in this equation. You're the one who's, by practicing your rights to push back, you are removing my rights to be able to do to you what I think I should be able to do or say to you what I should be able to say. I think that's a topsy-turvy world. And again, I'm seeing pushback on that. Not without consequences. People's lives are being destroyed. I have so many cases and clients in my office who have been fired, who have been doxxed, who have been retributed against by their employers simply for having an opinion on social media that was not in any way violent, not in any way hateful, but that the company thought was not right for them. And students as well who are disciplined, and faculty members, including on this campus. And so it's not without a price, but it's a price worth paying to stand up for the truth and what you believe in.
Thank you. Laurie,
So you asked us to end on a happy, cheerful note.
what's giving you hope?
So I believe in the university. I believe in the idea of the university. I think it's an idea, one of the few enduring things that's still around besides religious institutions, the Catholic Church and universities founded 850 years ago that still endures in a world where so much changes, where so much language changes and new technology. These universities endure, and the idea of the university is a noble and important idea, enriched by the struggles of the Enlightenment to make the medieval university even more robust and more interesting and more important. And I treasure that. I treasure it, and I treasure what the University of Chicago aspires to be. And it makes me optimistic that we can still be that. It does, makes every day that it goes well on campus and people like their classes and are interested and engaged and passionate about their work. It's a wonderful thing to have a university, and it's a treasure that we all have to protect. Right. So that's the fact that I think we're very devoted, fiercely devoted to free speech and devoted to protecting that is one more remarkable thing about the University of Chicago is our deep commitment to those principles and to the Calvin Report that guide us. And while it's difficult, it's central. I don't do politics. I do text. I teach ethics, and I'm optimistic that the kind of teaching that I can still do, and I've done for 25 years, in a process called scriptural reasoning, in which colleagues in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity meet together over text and study text together, the shared text of the Abrahamic tradition, sometimes the text of other traditions, but read Torah and the Quran and the New Testament together and study it together, that can still happen in classrooms. It happened this fall despite everything. And I love that seminar, and I'll continue to teach that seminar. I'm optimistic that that's what the university is for, that sort of inquiry. And that makes me happy to think about our capacity to do that.
Nico.
I'm a rule follower. It says, please move to your question, so I'll be very quick in saying that there is nothing new under the sun. All the free speech convulsions you're seeing right now, if you look at the history of free speech, have happened throughout history. I already mentioned what happened when the printing press came along. But questions about national security and TikTok, I mean, we investigated that sort of stuff during the Pentagon Papers and the Vietnam War. Concerns over the sort of information and content and speech that children have access to. We had national conversation and horrors over that with comic books and Prince and the Parents Music Resource Center. You know, this stuff has happened before. We've had conversations about encampments and building occupations in the 60s. So all this stuff has happened before, right? And there is wisdom in the past. Sometimes we forget the past, but it's always there to learn from again. And I think, you know, it's worthy of investigation and reflection in this moment.
Great. Thank you all. I'll say conversations like this with passion and respect give me hope. So we're going to go to questions.
Mike is over here, please.
Sorry, Mike is...
Yeah, come line up behind the mic. I'm going to ask the first question. I'm Vera. I'm a sophomore in the college. Thanks so much for speaking with us today. My question is, if there was one thing you could change that university administration is doing right now, what would you change, specifically looking at universities that have had mass demonstrations?
Follow their missions. I think a lot of colleges and universities have lost sight of what their core mission is, and I think the University of Chicago has, in fact, probably done the best job at centering its mission when it writes policies. If you look at the Calvin statement, it concluded that it needed to adopt a position of institutional neutrality because that was essential to the university's mission of the preservation, dissemination, and creation of knowledge. That the university is the host and sponsor of critics, it is not themselves the critic. And if you're going to have this truth-seeking process, you need to adopt a position of institutional neutrality to let the critics do their job and not create a chilling effect for it. So I think more colleges and universities would do well to adopt the Chicago approach.
Thank you for modeling a perfect, concise question. I'm going to ask everybody to keep them relatively short so we can get to as many as possible.
Yeah, I'll be quick. My name's Olivia. I'm a fourth year in the college. I kind of just wanted to touch base a bit on the chilling of speech that you all kind of touched on tonight, and there's definitely a lot of that going on campus. A question I think a lot about is what conditions there need to be in order for students to feel like they genuinely can speak freely. I would say a lot of people would refer to a certain level of bravery being needed on both the listener and the speaker. However, some would say that in order to be brave, that kind of reflects an environment where the cost of speaking is really too high. I guess as a student, I don't really see, faculty or students often speaking bravely or listening to one another. There's definitely just a decrease in that. And I'm really just curious for your advice for college students right now in this moment as to how we can do something in widening what some would refer to as the Overton window of acceptable speech, when so much of what is being, deemed to live within that window is being defined for us, whether it's really aggressive demonstrations on the quad of what certain students view or whether certain professors are expressing acceptable views in class. I'm just genuinely curious for your advice for widening that Overton window. Sorry, that was long.
Who wants to take it?
I mean, I could go, but I just answered the last one, so I would defer. Or I could answer.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, because I have a little something.
No. At FIRE, we have this position we've always adopted called the strong student model, which is that we've always taken the positions that students aren't too weak to live with freedom, that students are strong enough to be offended, to hear ideas that they might not disagree with, and to speak up. Of course, there are a lot of things that colleges and universities can do to encourage an environment like that, and should do. And it starts with not punishing students for doing exactly that, right? But they need to have the courage to speak up. And one of the things that I'm increasingly worried about is this, like, these trauma-informed justifications for censorship, what's been referred to as safetyism, that's cropped up in the last 10 years. There's just been a shift for students demanding that those in authority protect them from scary ideas or offensive ideas. And it's kind of turned our strong student model on the head, and it's not something we can appeal to as much. And it kind of turns the things that students at Berkeley were advocating in the 60s, although you know it better than me, when they threw off in loco parentis, in place of parent, the idea that the university isn't the parent, on its head. And so are we asking for the parents again? Are we asking for administrators to play parents and tell us what Halloween costumes we can't wear? I mean, maybe. I'd just say that's a slippery slope, and we shouldn't reverse the hard-fought victories that the activists in the 60s won for us.
Can I just add something real quick? I think differences between students should be negotiated through rigorous debate and engagement. There shouldn't be an otherization and a line in the sand between two sides of any debate or any issue the way there is in the world, because universities are basically, they're prepping up these young people to face a world that is very diverse with very different opinions that go at each other. And if you look back at any glorious age of any empire, including our own, it was always at a time, it always came with rigorous debate as a central point of negotiating differences. And any that crumbled or became a dictatorship or a tyrannical autocratic regime, it was always one in which debate was shut down for whatever reason. It's offensive, it's scary, it's this, it's that, it could lead to this or lead to that. I think universities need to take the side of, the Oxford-Cambridge historical model of respectful, powerful, no holds barred, but no authorization and no criminalization of anybody's opinion kind of debate system.
I think
let's go to the next.
So the interesting question is, what are their limits on this? And so, as a big free speech advocate, I believe it, I defend it, but the trouble is, something happens to the university if day after day people feel terrible about being there and like they can't speak at all. They feel discouraged, they feel hated. If you feel hated every day when you walk on campus, something's happening to the staff and to the faculty and to the students that we don't want to happen. It's not a good thing to happen. And we don't have words for this yet. We don't have words for what happens when our open space of free speech is filled up with the rhetoric of one side of a debate. And there's no space, really, for the other side of a debate. There's just no space. And it's filled up with some of the most extreme, frankly, anti-Semitic rhetoric I've heard in my long life. It's just filled up. And here I am trying to defend the freedom to fill it, right? Because, of course,
but again, this ad hominem.
Okay.
Ad hominem.
We got a lot
I want to go to
questions.
we got so many questions. I want to go to the next one. I'm sure we'll get more to say.
sorry.
It's okay.
Hi, thank you for sharing your opinions. And my question is that free speech in real life is protected by Bill of Rights and also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But similarly, is also the right to open impartial trial and free procedure. However, on social media, because they claim to be private ownership, they kind of establish a secret dictatorship. They kind of suspend your account and they don't tell you a clear reason. And they say that we'll review it, but they never told you, like, they did not give you an open or impartial kind of tribunal. So how do you think, I mean, also for new generations, like we use social media more than we interact in real life. And so being suspended on social media might cause a greater disturbances than being limited for in free speech in real life. So how do you see that this kind of secret dictatorship of social media empires could be tackled? Would there be some virtual impartial court, or then who will be the judge in those cases? Thank you very much.
It's a great question. I actually think it's outrageous how little money these platforms spend to address this problem. You know, it's very difficult to govern billions of users, which, like, you know, Meta has, I think, 3.2 billion people using its products. It is difficult and expensive to set up some sort of administrative regime that can handle that. That said, they've barely tried. The one thing that they did try was setting up this thing, the Oversight Board, which is it is independent, although it is funded by Meta, and it is the final word on whether certain posts can stay up or whether they have to come down. They haven't yet done anything with the question that you raised, which is, well, what if my account gets suspended unfairly? And this is something where I think that we really need to pressure them to do more, because so many people make their livelihoods now on these platforms. And the way that people lose their accounts can often be very capricious. They often, they make a lot of mistakes out there. So you're right to raise the issue. It's a big problem.
Thank you.
So certain language on social media, certain types of posts carry farther because of intentional decisions made by the companies. For example, researchers have found that posts that containing more moral, emotional language can, and that's language like should, evil, genocide, for instance, those travel much farther than other types of posts. And that's due to conscious decisions made by what the companies want to optimize for when they make their algorithms. So my question is, do you think it would be fair to have regulations in place, or for companies to basically normalize the amount of traffic those posts get? And on a broader level, how can companies claim to be neutral when their algorithms necessarily have to make curative decisions, and they're always occupying a curative role in that manner?
Take a quick step. You know, a platform where, the way people talk about social media, it does give you the sense that everybody thinks that every post should get the exact same amount of engagement, right? Of course, everyone wants to sort of go viral and feel like they're winning, but also we feel like maybe everyone is entitled to some level of engagement. I don't really think that. I think that some ideas are going to seem more interesting than others. I don't think you want to sort of regulate that at the level of the algorithm. So I understand the frustration there, but I don't know how you solve it via software and still have those platforms be usable and fun to read.
Thank you for the discussion. So I believe that the debate on free speech has never been as questioned as it is right now. And so my question is, why is that? Is it because of the increase in hate speech or social media? And how do we adjust the law and the Constitution to respond and regulate the current circumstances? Thank you.
I mean, I think it has something to do with social media, for sure, is that we can all participate in international conversations in a way that we just couldn't before, when all of our information was one-directional, coming from 4 networks and the newspaper we received at our doorstep in the morning. So there's just a lot more people participating in the conversation right now, and as some of the questions have alluded to, the way they're participating in the conversations on social media, they're being censored, and there's no appeal process, and so they get concerned about whether their voice is actually free.
Actually, I want to agree with Ahmed on your assessment of why this is, this is a moment in history that's a really important pivotal moment in history, for how we think about justice, for how we think about war, for how we are going to live together in this world. Wars all over, famine all over, wars all over, the climate burning up, right? An election upon us. This is a moment in which we embrace political speech. We want to increase speech. Yep. So there's something extraordinary about students and campuses being alive with debate again that I must say, people feel and have a right to feel like they care passionately about life and death and war and peace in a way that has not been the case since the Vietnam War. Yeah. And I think that that's why we then have to negotiate what are the limits to that speech, and that's why free speech then becomes an issue. I share your concern with the centering of the plight of the student as opposed to the actual content of what's going on. Suddenly it becomes about dropping charges against students or things about campus. But I do think this is a moment for both Jews and for Palestinians to really think about the vision of their future, and that's not a trivial moment in history. No. And the thing that happened, the things that are happening now about the limits of violence and the limits of speech are debates that need to be had in humanity.
Oh, I know we're running out of time. Let me just say one last
Yes, but I know you have
sentence.
to leave, so you go ahead.
I'd be remiss not to mention the obvious, which is the side that is pro-Palestinian, really it's pro-humanity, is filled with Jewish voices and Jewish leadership, okay, including on this campus and every campus. So it's not a line in the sand between two religions or two ethnicities or two nationalities. It's two ways of looking at the world. And the Jewish community populates both sides, not one side, but both. Now, the second and last point to be made here is students don't censor anybody. Students speak their mind. The other side, God knows they have the ability to speak their mind, and they do. It's not like we've not heard from Zionist voices in America in the last 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years. It's everywhere. So there's definitely, it's just that it's not as popular anymore. It's not because of censorship. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I know you have to leave.
Popular in my neighborhood.
Ahmed has to run this evening.
He's getting an award.
I don't know if we have time for any further questions, but I think the rest of us can stick around afterwards for a bit and we'll be glad to chat as well. I want to thank you all so much, and thank you to the panelists.